In the 1980s, the school bell rang, kids ran home and planted themselves behind their television for weekday afternoon cartoons. It was amazing. Welcome to Chasing Junk, where we look back at the 80s, 90s, and the things that we cherish from that time, and we talk about it. In this episode, we're going to explore weekday cartoons and why they were such a big deal in the 80s. We'll also talk about the decline and why they kind of faded out shortly thereafter. Now, before we do that, we should actually go back further to talk about how cartoons even existed in the first place. Now, in the 1930s through the 50s, you didn't watch cartoons on your television set at home. You went to the movie theaters, and that's where you would see theatrical shorts like Popeye or Tom and Jerry's, Looney Tunes, Betty Boop. And they would show those before the movie, just like we have movie trailers today. They would show theatrical shorts then, and then a newsreel, and then you would see the movie. So before you'd watch King Kong or Gone with the Wind, you'd watch Tom and Jerry. Now, because of that, there was this huge archive of theatrical shorts. So by the 1960s and 70s, you had decades worth of television shows that were just sitting there. And so they started selling the rights to these and syndicating them for television because in the 60s and 70s, now everybody's getting a television set inside their house. More and more kids are watching it. They're coming home from school and they want to watch cartoons. And so we buy the whole catalog of Tom and Jerry's or Popeye or Looney Tunes, and the local TV station can buy the rights to those and put them on for whenever they want, really. But it was after school when they started playing those. Of course, that gets us to the 1980s, and by that point, almost everyone had a television set. There were cartoons, a history of watching cartoons. In the 1970s, a lot of women started going back into the workforce. And what that meant was there were a lot of kids who were coming home to an empty house. We call those latchkey kids, right? And so the television started doing the babysitting. So we saw a boom in educational programming, thinking, let's at least give them something worthwhile to learn. And so then we saw the rise in the 1970s of TV stations like PBS that were free and available to everyone. So low income households could access PBS to watch Schoolhouse Rock and then later Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and then Reading Rainbow. So there was some great educational programming in the 70s and 80s. But really, there was this desire. Kids wanted something that was made just for them, that was exciting. And so we saw this huge explosion of action shows, action cartoons made specifically for kids growing up in the 80s. And that's me. So in the early 80s, we already had cartoons like Smurfs, Inspector Gadget, Scooby-Doo. So kids were rushing home. You wanted to be home right at 3 or 3:30 because if you got that at 3:35, you missed the beginning. And this was appointment television, right? If you missed the beginning, there was no DVR or streaming where you could watch it whenever you wanted. No, like if you missed it, you missed it. And so kids were rushing home to watch cartoons. It was a really big deal. I want to take a few minutes to talk about some of my favorite shows from the 80s. Bear in mind, we had pretty heavy restrictions in my household. I had to be really selective with what TV I watched. I would kind of sneak in sometimes and get away with watching a little bit more, but we had to pick and choose what we watched. And if you stuck with something, it was every day because these were becoming serialized. And so they had stories that went throughout the season instead of standalone episodes like we had with earlier cartoons. And that brings us to the first show I want to highlight, G.I. Joe, the Real American Hero.
We'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, real American hero. G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I.
Now, G.I. Joe is a show I actually didn't get into, and the reason for that is because if you missed an episode, you got kind of lost because the storylines went throughout. Now, you would have these shows showing up on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So 5 episodes a week. And if you missed part of the story, it was hard to get caught up. And so if you wanted to talk to your friends about it the next day at school, you better know what was going on. So again, you kind of had to pick and choose what shows you watched. And I didn't choose G.I. Joe. I also was a little bit young. That was popular in the early 80s, and I hit cartoons full-fledged in the mid to late 80s. Another thing that's really important about G.I. Joe, however, is that it came with a PSA at the end. So remember how we had PBS and all this educational programming? That was important for parents to feel like, all right, I'm not home, but at least my kids are getting something good this afternoon. Well, a lot of parents were probably nervous about all these shows where it's just fighting all the time. And so what they did is at the end of the episode, they'd say,
knowing is half the battle.
and so they teach these lessons. So whether it's G.I. Joe or He-Man or ThunderCats, at the end of the episodes, they would be like, all right, now kids, this is the lesson that you learned from today's episodes. And that made parents feel better about their kids, what their kids were watching.
Your mom had an accident. I'll take you to her. Uh-oh.
Look, Wild Bill.
Who was that?
Some stranger. He said Donnie's mom was hurt. I didn't know if I should go with him.
Well, just don't do what a stranger says. Check it out with an adult you know. Remember, a stranger
Can mean danger. Now I know.
and knowing is half the battle.
G.I. Joe!
All right, the next show that I want to talk about is Transformers.
The Transformers, more than meets the eye.
I actually didn't watch very much of Transformers either, but I love Transformers because of the merchandising. Now, Transformers was unique in that the characters sometimes would come out as toys and then go on the show, but other times it was toys that would debut on the show. You'd fall in love with that character, and then the toys would be released at the store and you could go buy the Transformer. I love Transformers. I have a collection of them today. Let me show you a few. So here's one of my childhood Transformers. It's pretty awesome. They made them really sturdy then, a lot of metal pieces and stuff, and you would see them on the show and then you'd play with them. It was really great. There were really cool cars and designs throughout the show, and even parts of popular culture. I loved that, we have this one, we have Soundwave, which is a similar one. It was just a cool part of the pop culture. And because of that, kids got really invested. So when like the Transformer movie came out and Optimus Prime died, like it was devastating to kids. I remember kids talking about that. And because I wasn't really into Transformers, it didn't impact me as much, but it was a big deal. Having the toys and then, of course, the lunch boxes, the breakfast cereals, the t-shirts and the posters, that was a big part of those weekday afternoon cartoons.
From uncharted regions of the universe comes a legend. The legend of Voltron, defender of the universe.
Now, Voltron is a show that I totally loved. I didn't watch it a lot, but when I could see it, I loved it because this whole idea, and there was always the build-up in the episodes where you would have these separate characters, but then they'd come together as Voltron. Of course, that paved the way for shows like the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and others that would kind of build together. But Voltron's the OG of that, and it's still a fun show. My kids grew up watching Voltron in the 2000s, 2010s, and they still love that show today. So Voltron has great repeat value. Now, my favorite show from all the 80s was the ThunderCats.
ThunderCats!
I think the ThunderCats did a good job. They had a good soundtracks. The animation, this was anime. It was maybe the first anime show, certainly the first one I recall. But these characters from Japan come over and they're on this alien planet. And it was just an exciting concept. But then the toys were really cool.
With Power Ring battery not included, make Lino's eyes light up.
I'm ready.
With Battle-Matic action, you can make them fight with their swords.
The sword is mine, Lion-O.
For kids that didn't have a lot of money, it was Star Wars characters, G.I. Joe, and He-Man. But if you had a little bit more money, then you got the ThunderCats, and it was kind of the premium toy of that time. Maybe that's why, as an adult, I started collecting ThunderCats. I just always wanted them as a kid, and now I have them as an adult. It's just super fun. Now, I think the show that was probably the biggest in the 80s, and certainly has had an impact over generations, is He-Man and the Masters of the Universe.
He-Man and the Masters of the Universe!
This week, the trailer for the new movie came out. It's coming out in the summer of 2026, and it looks awesome. Honestly, I think it looks really good, which, the old movie, the old movie with Courtney Cox and Dolph Lundgren or whatever that is, it was not a great movie, but it was magical if you were 8 years old. And I remember I went, my friend Chris, He had a birthday party, and we all went and saw Masters of the Universe together. And I thought and dreamt about that movie for years. It was huge, and it didn't hurt that I had the toys, that all the other merchandising was going on. And this is a show that just ruled the 80s. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, with its PSAs at the end, the really awesome toy sets that were affordable. That was the show of the 1980s. Well, I mentioned just a few shows. What are the ones that I didn't mention that you loved? What were your favorite shows of the 80s as you grew up and watched them? What ones do you think made the biggest impact on culture and society? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. So we've gone through a bunch of shows, and they were huge. And in the 80s, the ratings were at an all-time high. Everybody was talking about them. It was appointment television at its finest, and kids would rush home for it. So what happened? Well, the truth is, whatever happened, it happened very gradually. And I think there were a number of contributing factors to the decline of weekday afternoon cartoons. Let's talk about a few of those. I think the first thing that we should mention is there was a shift in how kids organized their time, partly because of what was available to them. So we started having more organized and club sports and other extracurriculars that would pull us away from television. There were more after-school programs and options for staying at school and doing other things. And of course, there was also video games, right? The NES came out in the mid-80s, and that started pulling kids away from appointment television viewing because they could play video games whenever they wanted for as long as they wanted, and it was always there. So that started fragmenting the market. Of course, the other way to fragment the market is to add more shows, and we started creating channels like Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network, which were dedicated to cartoons, but now there were a lot more options, so less kids were watching cartoons together or with their families because there were too many options. We also developed new technologies that allowed us to watch shows whenever we wanted. So first it was VCRs for those rich kids up the street that could actually record a show and watch it whenever they wanted. But then we started getting VHS tapes that we could play and watch the show, then DVDs. And of course, there was in the 2000s, we started with streaming and DVRs. And of course, today kids can watch whatever show they want, whenever they want. So it's completely different than having to be there to watch a show during the afternoon. So that change in our structure of what we did in the afternoons, as well as just being able to watch shows whenever we wanted, we saw that as a gradual decline to the golden era of weekday afternoon cartoons. When you think about it, the tragedy here is weekday afternoon cartoons weren't just things that we watched. They were things that we shared. For a few hours every afternoon, kids all around America were doing the same things, and we could talk about it at school, and we could connect with the characters, and we could share those with our families, with our friends. It was an important part of our culture, which is why it trickled into merchandising and even like breakfast cereal boxes and things like that. It's also probably part of the reason that so many of those things are coming back, is because that was kind of a lost age for us that grew up during that time, where we're like, kids played together, they did things together. Even if it was watching TV, they were doing it together instead of on their single screen by themselves. Of course, that idea of shared pop culture moments is what this channel, Chasing Junk, is all about. So this is a new kind of a video for me. It was fun doing the research for it, but I'm not sure how you guys are going to respond to this. Let me know if you want more of these shared pop culture moments. If you want me to dig deeper into a certain television show or any other pop culture phenomenon of the 80s and 90s, I would love to do it. I just don't know if anyone cares to watch this kind of stuff. And if this video brought back any memories for you, I would love to hear about it in the comments. What did this remind you of? I love talking about baseball cards and doing those countdowns and things like that, but I'd really like to, moving forward, to dig a little bit more into, Saturday morning cartoons, the rise of toy-driven television, and other pieces of 1980s pop culture that we all grew up with. If that's of interest to you, don't forget to subscribe and like this video, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.